Okay, so good evening. So tonight I want to talk to you about how they went about resolving one of the great challenges of early global maritime exploration, the need to efficiently, effectively, and above all, accurately track longitude. It's the quest for east and west. So, what's the connection of Norton? I think I hear you ask. Well, those of you who've been to any of my previous talks will be unsurprised to hear that I think there is one. You'll also be equally unsurprised to hear that I'm not going to tell you what I think it is now. I'm going to tell you a bit later, but I am going to need your help. So why is longitude so important? Well, it's one of the two coordinates that tells us all where we are, latitude and longitude. Now, latitude's pretty easy to work out, and people have been able to do it for a long, long time. Basically, you just need one of them. It's a sextant, right? You point it at the sun at midday, you calculate how far it is above the horizon, look it up in a book, and that's going to give you an estimate of what your latitude is. Longitude, much more difficult to figure out, and it became much more of a big deal after the discovery of the New World. Because in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the Bull of Demarcation, confirmed in the following year by the Treaty of Tordesillas. And in that, he took a line about 100 miles west of the Azores, and he just arbitrarily allocated all the land west of that belonged to Spain, and all the land east of that belonged to the other great maritime superpower of the day, Portugal, as you do when you're a medieval pope, right? And that kicked off this huge arms race of exploration east and west. Now, the other thing you've got to do with your coordinates is you've got to find the 0 point for them. Now, latitude, again, it's fairly easy. It's the equator, right? Longitude, again, much harder. So longitude's either been proposed to be measured or actually measured from Jerusalem, from Rome, from Pisa, from St. Petersburg, from Paris, from Philadelphia, and of course, London. It's much more political than geographic or scientific. So why is not being able to calculate longitude such a big deal? Well, let me give you some examples. When Columbus went to the New World in 1492, the maps that he had said that the globe was about 25% smaller than what it actually is. And that's one of the reasons why he was convinced that he was in India when he was actually in the West Indies. Now, to be fair to him, how was he to know that there was a complete continent in the way? And there was no for any 1,000 miles lengths, well, 1914 anyway. And of course, isn't it ironic that he's famed for discovering America, whereas what he actually really discovered was the Bahamas and Venezuela. The first man to sail around the world was Fernandez, 1519. And to do that, of course, he has to go around the bottom of South America, right? Now, you would have thought, wouldn't you, that going around the bottom of South America is as simple as sailing south till there's no more land and then turning right. But if you have a look at a detailed map of the bottom of South America, about Cape Horn and Terra del Fuego, it's a maze of little channels and inlets, right? He doesn't know how wide South America is at the bottom. He can't measure longitude. He's got pretty crappy maps, right? Imagine the number of blind alleys and dead ends that he must have sailed down, turned around, and had. Him 8 days to sail through what eventually became the Straits of McCormick. It must have been an absolute nightmare for him. Fast forward to 1707. The magnificently named Sir Cloudesley is on his way back from the Mediterranean, from Gibraltar. He can't measure longitude either. He thinks he's far enough west of Brittany not to run into France. He hopes he's far enough east not to run into those guys, the Scilly Isles, those razor-sharp collection of rocks just off the coast of Cornwall, that even by then was already the graveyard of many ships. He gets into the English Channel, and one of the sailors on his flagship, HMS Association, Let's call him Jeremiah. Jeremiah to him and he says, well, I've been sailing this route for years, probably decades. He says, Sire, I fear that you're further west than what you think you are. I think you're actually west of the Scillies, not east. What to do, hey? Well, Sir Cloudesley takes the action, of course, that is most appropriate to any early Georgian sea captain. He immediately has him hanged for insurrection, for daring to question the decision of an officer, as you do. Sir Cloudesley then goes up to where he thinks the correct spot is, turns right, and of course runs smack bang into the Scilly Isles. His other 3 ships follow him in. On that night, 22nd of October 1707, there's over 2,000 men drowned. There are apparently 2 survivors. Imagine as he's on the beach, he's thinking a couple of things. Firstly, I wish I was Jeremiah. And second, I'm going to cop it when I get to the pearly for having caused of all those men when I meet one. Well, unfortunately, I didn't have to wait. A woman walking along the shore saw him walk up there and immediately thought, that's a very nice emerald ring, and promptly murdered him for it. She allegedly confessed on her deathbed decades later, even produced the ring. Now, those 2 stories are both disputed, the hanging and the murder, no doubt by Sir Cloudesley's descendants and the residents of the good Isles of Scilly. But then again, as Mandy Rice Davies almost famously said in the Profumo scandal, they would, wouldn't they? Let me give you one more example. 1741, Commodore George Anson is also sailing around the world as skipper of HMS Centurion. He gets around the bottom of South America into the Pacific. But he's got a big problem. He's running critically short of fresh food and water. His crew are already starting to drop like flies from scurvy, that scourge of early global maritime exploration. It's estimated that between 1500 and 1800, 2 million sailors died from scurvy. But help is at hand. People who've gone before him have told him about the Juan Fernandez Islands. Great deep water anchorage, lots of fresh food, lots of fresh water. Fantastic. They've even told him broadly how to get there. It's at 35 degrees south. Because he can measure latitude, he knows how to get to 35 degrees south. They arrive there on the 24th of May. But because he doesn't know how to measure longitude, he can't see land in either direction. He doesn't know whether to turn left or turn right. All right, Abel Seaman Smith, you're my navigator. Do I go left or right? East or west? And by the way, your life, forget about your life, you're just a seaman. My life as captain and all the rest of the crew's lives depend on your decision. East or west? West. All right. They go west for 4 days. All of a sudden, Commodore Anson gets a crisis of confidence. We've gone the wrong way. He turns the ship around, sails back 4 days to where he started, 2 days further on east. He gets there on the 3rd of June. Have a wild guess what they see. South America. Chile, just south of Santiago. Cliffs all the way down to the sea, no anchorage, no fresh food, no fresh water. Damn your eyes, Smith. When I write the history of this expedition, we noted that you need to sail in the wrong direction. Have to turn around, sail back 2 days to where they started, 4 days to where they turn around. They get there on the 9th of June. Would you believe it? They only had to sail less than half a day further west and have a guess what they saw. The Juan Fernandez Islands. They get there on the afternoon of the 9th of June. If they'd known how to measure longitude, they'd have been there on the 28th of May. In that approximately 2-week period, 80 of his men died from scurvy. In his overall expedition with his 6 ships, he started out with over 900 people, finished up with about 350. And he's just one of, no doubt, hundreds of ships sailing blindly around the world, not knowing where they're going. Surely the major global maritime superpowers have got to put their heads together and figure out a solution to this. Sharpish. But if you reckon that it's hard to do this on Earth, you should try it in space. Now, excuse me, a brief diversion into one of my favourite topics, the US's manned lunar exploration program. Because in space, as well as no one being able to hear you scream, as well as not knowing north, south, east and west, you don't know forwards or backwards. You don't know left or right. You don't even know up or down. Because just because your feet are there doesn't mean that that's down. What they needed was the Apollo guidance computer. Now, if you reckon that the personal computing revolution started with Mr. Gates and Claire early 80s and Apple and Microsoft, I reckon it started early 60s when MIT designed that for NASA. It's about 2 foot by 1 foot. It doesn't take up entire rooms of buildings. It doesn't need false floors and water cooling. It doesn't need to be operated by men in white coats. It's operated by the end user. It's a phenomenal piece of kit. I reckon there's a complete Lunar Society presentation just about that thing. It's literally decades ahead of its time. Anyway, I digress. There's lots of different ways of measuring longitude if we need to do it. You can plot your position against the stars if it isn't cloudy. You can plot the position of the sun across the sky. Or you can get your clicker during the daytime. You can plot how long it takes the moon to come out from the shadow of the Earth during a lunar eclipse. But they don't happen very often. Or you can plot your position of the moon against the stars. But that looks like it's really hard as well. The other problem is that they didn't really know the accurate position of the stars very well in those early days. Because those things are so vague and there's lots of things to hit, Channel Islands, Scilly Isles, it is literally hit or miss. It's not good enough. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just figure out on a ship how fast your ship's sailing, multiplied by how long you've been sailing at that speed? That'll tell you how far you've gone. They knew roughly that if you sailed at about 10 knots, you'll cover 1 degree of longitude in about 7 hours. That first one, how fast is my ship going? A lot of sailors can figure that out by gut feel or experience, right? What they haven't got is a clock that works accurately at sea. But then in 1610, Galileo rides into town. With his telescope, he discovers the big 4 moons of Jupiter. He christens them the Medicean moons. Crawler, have a wild guess who his sponsor was. He discovers a number of things about them, that they go behind the bulk of the great planet at very frequent times, up to 1,000 times a year between the 4 of them. They also take a very prescribed amount of time to go behind the planet and come out again, that you can measure. If you've got one of those, a seletone, or seletone, no doubt is an Italian. And Galileo and so queuing up to wear that piece of pick, do you reckon? But there's some problems with it. Well, for a start, you need to be able to see Jupiter. There's about a number of days in a month when you can't see it. There's apparently a number of months of the year when you can't see it. If you're in the middle of a storm getting chucked up and down, left and right on a ship, it's going to be very hard to keep Jupiter in the viewfinder. And thirdly, I would imagine it takes a fair amount of literacy and skill to be able to drive that thing, which is not in great supply in your average 16th and 17th century sailor, who either volunteered when they were 14 or were snatched off the streets of Bordeaux or out of the pubs of Portsmouth, not so voluntarily. You can imagine how the conversation might have gone. All right, we're going to figure out where we are by measuring the transit of the moons of Jupiter. Well, what's that? It's a planet. Whereabouts is this Jupiter? It's up there. Up there. Well, how far away is this Jupiter? Is it further than Southampton? Like, that's about as far as your average Portsmouth boy would ever have been in his life. And he only went there because those pathetic merchant navy people couldn't fix their ships when they broke down. But it was a nice day out, plus they got to beat them up in the pub afterwards. I said, no, it's a bit further than that. And to see it, I have to wear the stupid hat. Yeah, I'm afraid you do. You don't happen to have any jobs up in the rigging where I could put my physical safety at great peril by any chance, does ya? Hey? Because I reckon if I'm getting tossed around like a cork in a huge storm in the middle of the Atlantic, measuring the transit of the moons of a planet that's 600 million kilometres away is not the first idea that's leaping into my head at that point. I don't know, is that just me? I don't know, what do you think? I don't think so. But hey, Galileo's the boss, right? He's the rock star of Renaissance astronomy. If he thinks it's a good idea, it's a good idea. By about 1650, it becomes a very popular way of measuring longitude on land. But then in 1660, Christian Huygens, a Dutch astronomer, somewhat of a protege of Galileo apparently, invents the pendulum clock. It's got a much more accurate mechanism because it uses a spiral balance spring, which is a nice idea unless you're getting tossed around in that washing machine in the middle of the Atlantic, then it's not going to work so well. Plus, there was also a bit of a dispute with Robert Hooke in England, who also claimed to have invented it. And again, Robert Hooke was notorious for starting arguments with people, most famously Sir Isaac Newton. So there's a few problems there. Speaking of England, when Charles II comes to the throne in 1660, he inherits the biggest merchant fleet in the world. He needs a solution to longitude. So he creates the position of Astronomer Royal. Sir John Flamsteed's the first occupant. He says, right, I want you to map the position of the moon against all the stars. He says, well, sire, I may need a building in which to do that. He says, all right. So he builds him one, Royal Observatory, finished in 1676. Over the next 4 decades, Flamsteed does about 30,000 observations of the moon and the stars. You could potentially use a magnetic compass. It will always point at magnetic north. Pole star is always at true north, and you can measure the angle between them. Well, a few problems with that. If it's cloudy, all bets are off. And secondly, magnetic north keeps moving. Over the 20th century, it's moved over 1,000 kilometres. Since 1970, the average annual rate of movement has increased from 9 to 52 kilometres a year. It's a moving target. Sir Kenelm Digby came up with the powder of sympathy theory that he published in his pamphlet called Curious Inquiries. And in that, he said, if you've got a dog with an injured paw, and that paw's in a bandage, if you take the bandage off the dog, put the dog on a ship, sail it away, and at a known time on the shore, if you dip the dog's bandage in the powder of sympathy, wherever the dog is, it'll yelp. And the sailors can all say, 1 o'clock already. Problem with that is, on a long sea voyage, like across the Atlantic, whatever injury you have on your dog will heal. So you may need to periodically re-injure your dog. William Whiston and Humphrey Didon invented the sound and light theory. And that said, again, if you sail off on a ship and on the shore, if you fire a cannon, they knew roughly how fast sound travelled. So if you heard that cannon, you could figure out how far away you were and therefore what longitude you were at. If you were further away, they could fire it right up in the sky. They could also do when you saw it and or when you heard it, and then you could roughly figure out where that was. And someone said, okay, what are you going to do on a really long sea voyage, like across the Atlantic? And they said, well, we'll put lots of ships about 600 miles apart at known positions of longitude, and we can fire the cannons off there. And they said, well, the water's really deep out in the middle of the Atlantic, thousands of feet. What are you going to keep them exactly 600 miles apart? Really long anchor chains? And they said, well, that example's only going to work at that latitude. What are you going to do about these guys down here? You're going to need more ships, dozens of them, hundreds of men. Ideas are getting increasingly wilder and wackier. Surely one of the great maritime superpowers has got to come up with something to put some sense in to the search for a solution to this problem. So one of them does. In 1714, the Brits create the Longitude Prize. And that says, if you can estimate longitude to an accuracy of half a degree, you can win yourself £20,000. That's millions of pounds in today's money. 2/3 of a degree will get you 15. A whole degree will get you £10,000. For a device to do that, it would need to keep time to an accuracy of about 3 seconds every 24 hours. At the equator, 1 degree of longitude is about 68 miles. So if you can measure longitude to an accuracy of 34 miles, you can win yourself millions of quid. Now that's a lot of money. So they set up a governing board to look after it, the Board of Longitude. And there's some pretty heavy hitters on there. The Astronomer Royal, President of the Royal Society, who in 1714 is one Sir Isaac Newton. First Lord of the Admiralty, Speaker of the House of Commons, First Commissioner of the Navy, and from Oxford and Cambridge, the Savilian, Lucasian, and Plumian Professors of Science. Surely, with all of those learned men on that committee, they will be able to fairly and independently adjudicate the prize. Don't call me Shirley. All right. A pretty warm early favourite to win that prize was the lunar distancing method for working out longitude. Because people knew that the moon moves across the sky. It moves about its own width across the sky every hour. So if you took about 6 or 7 measurements of that, you need a device to do it, the lunar quadrant. But luckily, John Hadley in the UK and Thomas Godfrey in the US both were working on it at about the same time. So to do that, if you documented the position of yourself against a known, actually estimate what you think it is, compare it, it's in the same spot against that star at a longitude, then you can figure out what your longitude is and multiply it by the speed, and that's how it's going to work. Some problems with that. There's about 6 days in every month when the moon is too close to the sun, so you can't see it during the daytime. And also, it's a pretty complicated thing, isn't it? If you have a look at it, right, is that you have to measure the altitude of the known star. You have to measure the altitude of the moon. You have to measure the angle between them. Those measurements take several hours to do. And also, there's a number of steps involved. You have to do some planning. You have to figure out how you're going to measure the moon, left-hand side, middle, right-hand side. You have to do some adjustments for parallax or refraction. And you still need to be able to measure time to be able to get it done. So you either need to have a mate who's got a Canon, or you need to do it some other way. And strangely, all the dogs appear to have disappeared. Wouldn't it be a lot simpler if you could figure out how fast is my ship going, multiplied by how long has it been sailing at that speed, and at the equator, divided by 68 miles, and that will tell you how many degrees of longitude you've passed. It's simple. You don't need to know where Jupiter is. You don't need to wear a stupid hat. You don't need to know about parallax. You don't need to injure any dogs. It can work any time of the day or night, if it's cloudy or it's not cloudy. And it doesn't need a huge amount of literacy or skill. Now, as we said, sailors can figure out broadly how fast their ship's going. What they can't do is measure how long they've been sailing at that speed. If only we knew a bloke who knew how to build clocks. Introduce our hero, John Harrison. He was born in 1693 in Yorkshire, but he moved to Barrow and Humber in Lincolnshire at the age of 4. And no, he wasn't a child prodigy, he ran away from home. His whole family moved there. He wasn't rich, he wasn't a member of the landed gentry, he wasn't a member of the aristocracy. He was one of 5 kids. His dad was a carpenter. Maybe he's going to be able to build us a clock that works at sea. Now, if we have a hero that we're going to cheer for, In a perfect world, we would have a villain to boo at. Now, I know we're coming up to that time of the year, panto-type season, and I know that you Brits are all very well trained in how to react when I introduce the villain. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Neville Masquerade. Thank you very much. Now, to be fair, he's an educated man and became a doctor, poster boy, and passionate supporter of the lunar distancing method for working out longitude. He even went on some voyages to the South Atlantic to St. Helena,
well done for carrying on.
calculations to go into the book to go about working it out.
What's it on?
John Harrison came to hate him with such passion.
Longitude.
For a very good reason.
Longitude.
Latitude.
Now, it became apparent from an early age that young John was pretty good at building things.
Oh, don't bother.
But his particular expertise appeared to be in clocks. In 1713, he actually built his first clock at the age of just 20. That one's in the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers Museum in the Guildhall in London. And as in all Harrison's clocks, and actually in a lot of the early clocks in general, not only does it work well, it's a gorgeous looking thing, isn't it? A lot of them are. It's made almost entirely from wood. He made other clocks a little later. If you want to go and see another one of his that's working, you can go to Brocklesby Park in Lincolnshire. He built that clock in 1722. That clock is still running today, 300 years later. Also made almost entirely of wood. And not just any old wood. It's made out of lignum vitae. It's a tropical hardwood. And its party trick is that it naturally exudes. That means you don't need to oil it. So if there's no oil in it, that's going to be thicker or thinner, depending on changes of humidity and temperature on a ship. Wouldn't that make a fantastic marine chronometer?
Because John's had great trouble. So what does he have to do?
So young John.
Okay, bye. Let's move, John. They can hear us.
Work. So in 1730, he goes to London to see the Board of Longitude. Now, the Board of Longitude is not easy to find. It doesn't have a building in which it lives in. It's weirdly 1730, even though it had been in existence for 10 years, it never met. All of the answers that they'd received so far were of the powder of sympathy type method, right? So they hadn't needed to put a quorum together to meet in person. They just sent them. Dear Shannon, idiot. And by the way, if we ever have an association in the future that's about preventing cruelty to animals, your letter is heading this way over there, sunshine. Signed, Board of Longitude. But he knows where one of them is, the Astronomer Royal, because he's at Greenwich. So he goes to see the second Astronomer Royal, Sir Edmund Halley, shows him the design. Halley really likes it. So much so, he even agrees. Rather than throwing into the bear pit of the full Board of Longitude, he sends him to see his eminent clockmakers, George Graham. Now, it would be fair to say that John and George got on pretty well. By all accounts, Harrison took his place at 10 o'clock one morning, 8 o'clock that night, they're still sitting around talking about clocks. Graham really likes the design as well. So Harrison goes away and he builds H1, 1735. It has 2 swinging compensating balance arms to deal with the knocks that it's going to get at sea. It has a whole bunch of anti-friction gear in it, so it doesn't need to be oiled. It has 4 dials on the front, one for seconds, minutes, hours, and days. It's not the most petite thing in the world. It weighs 75 pounds, and it comes in a case that's 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. But he takes it in to show it to Graham. Graham really likes it. So what are they going to do with it? They do some very small sort of water trials on the Humber, works fine. They decide to take it on a sea trial to Lisbon in 1736. In about that 24-hour period to Lisbon, H1 kept time to an accuracy of a couple of seconds. Worked really well. On the way back, it also impressed the hell out of them, because when they got into the English Channel, A lot of the crew were convinced that they were off a geographic feature called the Start, which is just near Dartmouth. Harrison said to them, "Oh, excuse me," because unhelpfully for a marine chronometer pioneer, he suffered really badly from seasickness. So he probably spent most of the voyage with his head over the rail, hurling his guts into the Atlantic. But after he'd done that, he said to them, "Actually, according to my instruments, I reckon that's the Lizard Peninsula." And he was right. The captain of the ship, Captain John Proctor of HMS Centurion, also said, "Yep, I reckon this thing works pretty well." Hang on a second, HMS Centurion? That name rings a bell, doesn't it? Wouldn't it be nice if he'd said, "That thing works really well. Can I hang on to that for a while?" I'm sure Commodore Anson, his successor of captain of HMS Centurion, and his dentist would have been very helpful to see that. So they get back, they now go and they're happy to see the Board of Longitude. The Board of Longitude say this thing works really well. Surely they must be in a good position to be able to ask for the next step in the process, which is a full Atlantic. But there's one person who argued long and loud and hard against John's device. Have a wild guess who do you think that might be? Actually, it's not him this time. It's actually him. John argues against his own device. Says, "Oh, it's really big, the pendulum could work better. Tell you what, I'm going to build you another one." He goes away and he builds H2, 1741. And it does have a number of improvements in it. It has a better uniform drive mechanism that gives it better temperature compensation. It does better about coping with shocks. Also, he goes into a bit of Galilean style sucking up. Have a wild guess who he's built that to impress? God. He hasn't done much in the miniaturization stakes. This one weighs 6 pounds. The society, rather than the full board of long, they test it, they bang it, they take it on some, it works well. But again, John says, "Oh, it could be better. I reckon I could do a better job." But I tell you, is it possible that I could have a bit of money to get me by while I build you another one? He asks them for £500. The board agrees. Eventually, they end up giving him 5 payments of £500. So John goes away and he builds them a better mousetrap, H3. Now, some good things can be done quite quickly. Eiffel Tower got built in 2 years. Sistine Chapel got built in 7 years, although they took another 11 years for all the decorations, including Michelangelo's being 4 years flat on his back doing the frescoes. Then you get that classic tradie to owner discussion like in the film. When is it going to be an end to it? When it's finished. Took them 14 years to build the Statue of Liberty. Took them the same amount of time to carve those American presidents' faces into Mount Rushmore. Took them well over a decade to put a man on the moon. It took John Harrison 19 years to build H3. And that's always puzzled clock historians, because it's not as if he was just working on it in his holidays. Apparently he worked on very little else. He did take some chargeable work to feed his family, plus he had those seed payments. But I suspect he's just one of these irritating perfectionist types who never knows when something's finished, who doesn't have someone to tap him on the shoulder and say, "John, I think it's good. You should stop now." He finishes it in 1756. It's a pretty complex piece of kit. It has 753 parts. It has a bimetallic spring, part brass, part steel, that automatically compensates for changes in temperature. He's even got the weight down to 60 pounds. It's only 2 foot by 1 foot. Again, it works really well. Again, John says, "I'm really not happy with it, it's still too big." But tell you what, I am so done building clocks for you people. Because this time he doesn't build them a clock, he builds them a watch. 1759, H4. It's only 5 inches in diameter. Now, as part of the casualty of all that miniaturization, the anti-friction gear can't be miniaturized, so this one does need some oil. And that is the device that he finally agrees to submit to the Board of Longitude in 1760. So, how are they going to test it? Well, as we know, H1 went on that sea voyage to Lisbon. H2 never went to sea at all. They were going to test both H3 and H4. Harrison withdrew H3, so it never went to sea either. They only tested H4. They finally get their Atlantic sea trial, October 1761. But John doesn't actually go on that voyage. I mean, to be fair, he is 68 years old at this point. Probably doesn't fancy an Atlantic sea voyage, particularly with his tummy. Now we need to introduce another player to our story. John's son, William, makes that trip. So they get over there on that 82-day outward voyage. H4 has kept time to an accuracy of 5 seconds. On the way back, they run into some really bad Atlantic storms. Now, you would have thought, wouldn't you, that the Board of Longitude would have taken great pains to protect this fragile and precious device. Not a bit of it. William takes to throwing blankets over it to try and keep it dry. He takes to sleeping with it underneath him to try and keep it warm. Even with all that drama, H4 over the 2 legs keeps time to an accuracy of about 2 minutes. Surely now the Harrisons will have to be awarded the prize. But the board does 2 things. Firstly, it writes in the letter. It says, your device has not met the board's requirements for recording of longitude at sea. What? One of the reasons they bounced them was apparently they'd done a control measure of the transit of the moons of Jupiter while they were in the West Indies. The Harrisons don't recall seeing that as a requirement. They either just made it up or it was on page 36 of the terms and conditions. But what can they do? Secondly, weirdly, even though they've denied them the prize, they gave them £1,500 out of the prize fund. Is there someone on the Board of Longitude starting to feel a little guilty about how the Harrisons are being treated? Don't know. The game goes on. The board says that there will be no Atlantic sea trials during the period 1756 to 1763, during the really imaginatively named 7 Years' War with France. After all, we can't take the risk of those fragile and precious devices falling into the hands of those evil frogs. Now, can we? But that's just nonsense as well, because as we heard, the Harrisons had already done one sea trial in 1761. Is it possible that someone on the Board of Longitude, like James Bradley, the 3rd Astronomer Royal, who's a passionate supporter of the lunar distancing method, have they got it in for them? But there is some good news. James Bradley dies. Hooray! There's a 4th Astronomer Royal appointed. Bad news. It's Nathaniel Bliss, also a passionate supporter of the lunar distancing method. In 1764, in March, the board demands a new trial. And they say, right, this time we're going to have an observer who's going to be appointed to make sure that you obey all the rules. Have a wild guess who gets appointed to that role. Him again. Imagine William's heart must sink when he sees him on the dock in Kingston. Over the 2 legs, on that second trip across the Atlantic, H4 performs brilliantly. It records longitude to an accuracy of about 10 miles. That's 3 times as good as the board had demanded. Surely now the Harrisons have got to be awarded the prize. But the board do nothing. Got some more good news. In January 1765, Nathaniel Bliss dies. Hooray! They appoint a 5th Astronomer Royal. Have a wild guess who gets the job. He's now on the board. Oh, God, this just gets worse, doesn't it? Unsurprisingly, the board springs into action with a spectacular piece of goalpost moving. They say, whatever device gets submitted, you have to make 2 replicas, one made by yourself, one made by someone else. So we can prove that it can be made more than once and made by more than one person. That device has got to be reviewed by an inspection team appointed by the board. After they've inspected it, you've got to explain it in detail about how it works, and then it's to be handed over to the board for a 10-month detailed observation period at the Royal Observatory. This rather again, like the Harrisons' prize, they get £10,000 out of the prize. What the hell's going on there? The Harrisons argued long and hard against this to no avail. August 1765, the inspection panel arrives at John's house. Have a wild guess who's been appointed head of the inspection team. Imagine what John thinks when he opens the door and sees him. They come in, John spends 6 days explaining to him in detail how H4 works. No doubt Maskelyne took extensive notes. At the end of that period, he said, right, we're now going to take all the devices away. Now, devices, yeah, as well as H4, they also took H1, H2, and H3, and all the plans about how to build them. When John quite rightly said, how am I going to build the first replica without H4 to act as a visual reference point and without the doco? No doubt there was a huge Maskelynian shrug of the shoulders. I don't know, not my problem. Now they're going to take it away. As you can imagine, the board have gone to great trouble to appoint the cheapest, crappiest cartage firm in the East End of London to take it away. Headed by, I don't know, let's call him Josiah. You can imagine Josiah walks in and says, right, where's all the stuff? Okay, it's moving, time's money, you know, go. And you know he's a ruffian because he speaks with a Cockney accent. Don't blame him, it's the law. Oh, yes, it is. Thank you. John says, wait a minute, I have to partially dismantle these devices, right? Because he's really worried about them being uttered across the horrible streets in the hands of his least competent moving firm. But he need not. This noise brings him quickly over to the. It's the sound of Josiah boys dropping H1 onto the pavement directly inside his house. They never made it to the car. The game goes on. 1767, the board actually publishes a document, the Nautical Almanac, how to calculate longitude using the lunar distancing method, probably edited by Neville Maskelyne. This is the same board that's fairly and independently adjudicating the prize. Conflict of interest, anyone? The observation period goes on because it's being done out at the Royal Observatory. Have a wild guess who's in charge of the observations. Ooh. No doubt he's using all the extensive notes that he's got about how to put it back together. Because John says, I'll go out there and put it back together for you. They say, oh no, you're not allowed to do that. We have to do it. Whether they didn't put it together properly again, or whether he couldn't be bothered doing the appropriate measurements, H4 fails the test in the observation period. At the end of that 10-month period, John says, oh, what's going on? When I get it back, I'll have a look at it and I'll figure it out. And they say, oh no, you don't get it back. We're going to keep it. There's probably a very good reason for that, because they publish another book, The Principles of Mr. Harrison's Timekeeper, with plates of the same, by Neville Maskelyne. Now, at least he doesn't have the barefaced cheek to just have his name on it. He puts John's on it as well, but his name's there too. It just gets worse. All right. He is getting some interest from other parties. I think he is. King George III says he'd like to see it. He invites John to the palace in January 1762. Once John's there, no doubt he takes the opportunity to have a bit of a whinge to the king about how badly he's being treated by the board. The king is rumoured to have said, "Oh, my God, Harrison, I'll see you rated." For some reason, he's come over all Hugh Laurie. The king also asks whether he can do his own observations of H5. So in the period May to July 1762, he does daily observations of H5 out of the palace. Again, weirdly, H5's worked really well up to this point, but it performs really erratically in the test. Harrison can't understand it. Neither can the king. He might have said something like, "Well, I don't understand that. I even put my lucky lodestones in the box with it." This would be your magnetic lucky lodestones. That's all right, we'll just take those out, put them over here, nice and safe. Without the lucky magnetic lodestones in the box, H5 over that 3 months records time to an accuracy of about 1/3 of a second. The matter even gets discussed in Parliament in the spring of 1763. Parliament, no doubt aware that the king's got his beady eye on them, watching you. They decide to award the Harrisons a payment of £8,750, not out of the prize fund, mind you, as a one-off parliamentary bounty. They also take the opportunity to do some further goalpost moving. They confirm the new requirements. Every device has got to have 2 replicas, a full Atlantic sea trial, 12 months observation in Greenwich, another Atlantic sea trial, another 12 months observation at Greenwich at the Royal Observatory. God, it just gets worse. Meanwhile, the game goes on. The second replica gets built, the one that has to be made by someone else. Larkham Kendall, a London clockmaker, makes that device. He builds it in 2.5 years. But then again, he probably got given the doco. The board demands another sea trial. And this time they're going to the Pacific with him, James Cook. Now, as you can imagine, growing up in Australia, we learned a lot about Captain Cook at school. And he's a fascinating guy. He was a pioneer in math with Sir Joseph Banks, with science, the use of lines to ward off speed. A great man, a leader, really good with the natives about being fair and kind. He created these amazingly accurate and gorgeous maps of the coast of New Zealand, the coast of Australia. They're in the National Museum in Sydney. And I reckon there's another Lunar Society presentation just about him. He says, right, they're going to do the distancing method, plus they're going to do the marine chronometer. He says, all right, I'll take H4 with me. And they say, oh no, you're not taking that. That stays here at Greenwich. They made him take K1. But that's all right. When Kendall had showed it to John, John agreed that it was a faithful replica of H4. So Cook takes that with him instead. Now, a bit of a side story about Captain Cook, if I may. When he got back from his second trip to the South Pacific, he's rumoured to have said to his wife Elizabeth, all right, I'm going to do one more trip to the South Pacific, and then when I get back, I'll be about 50. I'll retire from the Navy. Then we'll go to our lovely cottage in Yorkshire, play around in the garden. We can have lots of nice cups of tea and toast our toes in front of the fire. As we know, that didn't exactly work out, did it? He's killed by the natives in Hawaii in 1779. Elizabeth lived until 1835. That meant that she was a widow for 56 years. One more bloody trip. Yeah, right, okay. And her descendants didn't even get to toast their toes in front of the fire because they dismantled that building and they took it to the Fitzroy Gardens in Melbourne, which is where it is today. Now, if you ever get to see it, I would at the Fitzroy, very pretty. Now, I'm hopefully going to be seeing it myself because I've got my ticket booked for January 1, unless they close the bloody borders again. Fingers crossed. So Cook gets back in 1775. He's a huge fan of the marine chronometer. In his journal, he described it as my faithful timekeeping companion across all the vicissitudes of climate. Surely now the game is over. The Harrisons have got to be awarded the prize. But there is one more twist in our story. In March 1776, John Harrison dies at the age of 83. But officially recognized as winner of the Longitude Prize. Fast. So what happened after Harrison died? Well, there is one problem. When Larkham Kendall built that second replica, he said it cost him about £200 to build it. You can buy yourself a complete set of lunar distancing charts for about 20 quid. So there's still a slight scalability problem. But things move on. Thomas Mudge in 1777 makes another replica. Of course, it's got a out of the Royal Observatory. Have a wild guess who's going to be doing that. You'll also be unsurprised to hear he managed to break that one as well. But that's okay. But the boys Mudge £3,000 compensation for his inconvenience. The prize fund. 1770, John Arnold builds another replica. So announces plans to build a factory to build them at scale. 1803, Thomas Earnshaw builds another copy. Shows it to Maskelyne, who doesn't manage to drop it for a change. He says, oh, I really like that. Oh, what's his secret? 1805, John Arnold's son and Thomas Earnshaw are awarded £3,000 out of the fund recognition achievements. Well, they can do that, can't they? Having given to the Harrisons. But things are moving on. By 1805, you get yourself an armour for about 80 quid. You get yourself an Earnshaw for about 60 quid. So things are moving on. In 1791, the East India Company issue a new set of logbooks. And an addition to that is how to work out longitude using their marine chronometer. It becomes standard across all of their ships. In 1811, Neville Maskelyne dies! In 1828, the Board of Longitude is officially disbanded, having done, I reckon, a pretty poor job fairly and independently adjudicating the prize. By 1860, across the Royal Navy's 200 ships, they've got themselves a stock of 800 marine chronometers. Now, why they need that many is a bit of a mystery to me. Maybe because they're so small now, the captains keep losing them down the couch in their staterooms. Who knows? But it's probably fair to say that by then, the marine chronometer is the default way of measuring longitude at sea. And of course, haven't we come a long way to today? They're in our sat-navs, they're in our phones. We can measure longitude down to the meter, down to the centimetre sometimes. And we can even use it to drop bombs down the second chimney from the left of some evil warlord's house in the Middle East, controlled by a drone operator sitting in air-conditioned comfort, probably sipping a cafe latte in some underground bunker thousands of miles away in Oklahoma. We've certainly come a long way from when being to be able to measure it to an accuracy of 34 miles can win you millions of quid. Or not, as the case may be. So whereabouts are all these Harrison timekeeping devices today? Well, H1, H2, H3 and H4 are in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. H5 and the first Harrison clock from 1713 are in the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers Museum in the Guildhall in London. Now, hopefully with lockdowns being a thing of the past, I don't know about you, but I am long overdue for a trip back to London. I'm massively long overdue back to the Maritime Museum. I haven't been there. When I first went there, I did the standard rookie thing, like, oh, there's Admiral Nelson's uniform. Look, you can see where the bullet went in. Ah, isn't that good? All right. But this time, I will be making a beeline for Mr. Harrison's timekeeping devices. Weirdly, though, from what I believe, you can see H1, H2, and H3 working fine. The only one that isn't working is H4, because it must be fragile. You have to wind all that sort of stuff. It's the only one, bizarrely, that is to the board, and that's the only one that you can't see working anyway. So who's looking after them now? Well, given the National Maritime Museum, Royal Observatory, when they first went out there, have a wild guess who was looking after them. No doubt they were just chucked in dusty boxes out in storerooms out the back with blankets over the top. 1836, a clock historian called E.J. Dent, Edward Dent, found them and said, oh, that's not right. Can I restore them for you? I won't charge you for it. It took him 4 years. 1920, Lieutenant Rupert Gould also found them, also in poor nick. Said, can I restore them? I'll do it in my own time. Took him 12 years. Apparently, he pulled a bag of about 2 ounces of junk just out of H1. But now they're right a place in the National Maritime Museum's collection. But what about our hero? Surely it's time for him to get a bit more recognition. Now, I read a few months ago in the newsletter that in the village we'd formed our own Booker Prize panel and awarded the Hookie Bookie Prize. Now, I reckon we're all attendees of the prestigious Hook Norton Lunar Society. I reckon, why shouldn't we recommend that Mr. John Harrison be formally recognised as the winner of the Longitude Prize? Yeah! All right, Ian, I feel an email to the National Maritime Museum coming on. All right, I'll draft it up and then we'll talk. All right, okay. Now, there is a whole bunch of documentation about all this out on the internet. These are the ones that I looked at, but there's a whole bunch of other ones there. But there was one specific book that I looked at as a reference source, a book called Longitude by Davis Abel. And if you haven't seen it, it's a very good book about detailed backstories and human stories about John's battle with the board. I believe that a number of people have read it. I think it got done in the link group a few years ago in a session headed up by our own John. I would recommend it to you. All right, but not forgetting the connection of Longitude Hook Norton. Now that connection is, of course, that Hook Norton, like any location, has a longitude. So what's the longitude of Hook Norton? So let's have a little quiz, shall we, to find out. And to spice that quiz up, I've purchased out of my meagre pension funds a copy of the Davis Abel book to offer as a prize for the winning estimate. All right. And I've also created a little spreadsheet here to actually put in our guesses, and it's got the nearest estimates of the location to our guesses. Now, no doubt of you in the room here are thinking of surreptitiously reaching over to your phones and looking it up. My Lunar Society Supremos, Mr. Chalmers and Mr. Buchanan, will be cruising the room, keeping their beady eyes on you. Zoom audience, I'm afraid if we unmute your mics, all bloody hell will break loose in the room. Plus, you've also probably got your phones out already looking it up. Given that we can't see you, I'm sadly going to have to disqualify you from the quiz. Any complaints, please write to the Lunar Society Supremos back to Sunny and Norton. Now, given that you're all attendees of the esteemed Hook Norton Lunar Society, you will of course know that Hook Norton is west of Greenwich. So the answer will be in degrees west. So, ladies and gentlemen, to the nearest 1/10 of a degree. So for example, if we said, say 50.5, that's probably not right. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is the longitude of Hook? 4.1. No, you're in Madrid. 1.1. 1.1. Oop, yeah. Oh, you're in Leicester. All right. Is it?
Just under 2 degrees.
2 degrees. Ah. You're in Cirencester.
1.2.
1.2. Oh, you're in Loughborough, or you could be in La Rochelle. Right?
1.3.
1.3. Oh, you're in Banbury. Further estimates?
1.32.
No, to the nearest 110. Thank you very much. 1.4. Oh, you're in Bloxham.
I said 1.5.
1.5. Yes, Victoria! In the hand, the winner of the Rosie.
It was just said she's already closest.
Oh,
I said
no.
1.4.
So who said 1.4?
1.4? Who said 1.4? Who said 1.4?
1.3. You 1.32. 1.32. Congratulations, John.
Who said one? Somebody said 1.4. Who said? Did I say 1.4?
Yeah, go
Right,
on.
okay. Right. Well, winner. So for now, all I've got is to thank you for your attention. Wish you a pleasant rest of the evening, and I'm happy to turn it over to questions. Zoom audience, if you've got any questions, we're not going to unmute you because all havoc will break loose. If you want to put some questions into the chat, Nigel will call them out and we'll get them answered for you. So it's over to you, Ian.
Any questions?
What happened in the end to the prize fund? So what happened in the end to the prize fund?
Well, they've given away a reasonable amount of the money to some of it to the Harrisons and some of it to other people. When I added it all up, it does add up to £20,000. So when they've given away to Arnold's and Renshaw's in 1805, that is £20,000. But the crime is they never award the Harrisons the prize, which is just bizarre as to why they did that. Conspiracy theories may have found as to why. We had talked about it, how he wasn't a rich man, he was a member of the aristocracy, he was a carpenter's son. The people on the board of Longitude are scientists, they were convinced that the lunar distancing method was the way to do it. They just weren't convinced that a clock was ever going to get it done. Yeah.
Another question at the end.
Oh, that one question. What happened to his family? I'm interested. Does he still know?
I don't know the answer to that. I have to trace my Harrisons down the line, but it's a good question that I'll try and check up on. Yeah.
What did Maskelyne get out of it?
What did Maskelyne get out of it? He was just stubborn and he wanted the lunar distancing method to win because he was convinced that it was the best way of doing it, because he was a scientist and he was just bigoted in saying it must be the right answer. What was the question again? Yeah.
Is there another question?
Yeah, given the obvious importance of the problem, it's surprising that it was by France or Spain or
Yeah.
how is it that why did the British succeed when they were so disorganized?
I think part of it is to do with like the Industrial Revolution. Like the British were very good at inventing things. In the 1700s, it's the start of the Industrial Revolution, and led the way.
Mm-hmm.
So probably there were lots around who just got very good at building things. Armies of the people that came up in the Industrial Revolution. So Britain was a possible place to happen. Probably before then, when Spain and Portugal ruled the waves, it was probably too early for the technology to ride to the rescue because they just didn't have a way of manufacturing things with that degree of accuracy before the 1700s, would be my guess.
Although I think clock making was very well developed in France in
Yeah. Certainly on land, probably, but you put it on a ship, like your long case clock is probably not going to work overly well on a ship, right? So that was the problem about it working accurately enough at sea. And Harrison was the first one who solved it with the shock mechanisms and the anti-friction gear and that sort of thing. Yeah.
The French were not happy about the longitude 0 going through London, were they?
No, no. But then again, who won the prize or who didn't win the prize? Harrison was the one who did it. Once again, it's probably Britain's influence in that time to say, where else would you put it? But in the say mid to late 18th century, Britain rules the waves, right? Yeah.
This controversial question: has much changed when you read the anti-compete clauses in software engineers' contracts?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you might be right. But certainly it was interesting. They went to so much effort, like millions of pounds as a prize, and the governance on it was probably less than optimal. Would be my statement. Yeah.
Was there an actual benefit?
Well, it does if you spend enough time and if you're literate enough. The thing I really struggled with is whatever thing you do about measuring altitude, you've still got to estimate time, right? So that's the shortfall in it. And when you're in the middle of the Atlantic, have I been sailing for 3.5 days? Was it 4 days? Bang, I've run into that rock, right? So that was always the problem with it. On land, you can probably do it because, as you said, clocks work reasonably accurately on land, well before that, in the late Middle Ages probably. But on a ship, particularly in big seas like the Atlantic, it just doesn't work. Yeah.
If we're going to give a Lunar Society prize for longitude, who's putting up prize money?
Millions of pounds. We're just going to agitate for him being officially recognised because as far as I'm aware, he's never been officially recognised as the winner.
Do we know where he's buried?
I have these.
We could have
A pilgrimage. We could have a protest in front of it. Justice for the Harrison. Yeah.
We glue ourselves.
We have a question from Mark.
Yes.
Mark Dalloway. Did Britain get any material advantage from the invention, or did other countries get copies compatible technology at a similar time?
I would imagine that Britain would have got some initial benefit from it because the Board of Longitude sort of sponsored it. But other people had made replicas from the early 1800s. So probably in a 50-year period, Britain would have got some more benefit from it. But I think it was made much more widely available. All you need is a clock that works accurately at sea. That's all you need. And people, once Harrison had shown people how to make them, as we saw, like they were all British people, the examples I gave, but I'm sure there were lots of others. Once you'd seen the Harrison clock, I'm sure a competent clockmaker could do it. But Harrison was just the pioneer that figured out how to do it first. Yeah.
Did the original Lunar Societies in the 18th century ever discuss the problem? I don't expect you to know the answer to that.
No, it's a good question. That's the sort of thing that they should have been discussing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We could come up with a steam power.
Yes, exactly. They have the blokes who can do that. Mr. Watt and Mr. Bolton are going, I can do that. Yep, I can do that.